Welcome to Stealing from Wizards Volume 1, Pickpocketing, by R.A. Consul, read by the author. Chapter 7, The Ferry, Princess. Kuro woke with a start to the offensive cry of an alarm clock that hadn't been there when he'd fallen asleep. It rang and rattled around on top of an old blue steamer trunk that had also been left in the room overnight. A brass plate on the trunk was embossed with his name. On top of it sat a plastic container full of holes meant for carrying cats, a freshly laundered uniform, and a note. Kuro, it read, "Clean yourself up and get dressed. New socks and underwear are in the trunk as well. We will be leaving at 8:15 for the ferry to Avalon. We cannot be late." Kuro started to complain to the empty room about being ordered to clean himself up with no running water, but before he had a chance, a clawfoot tub strolled in and began to fill itself. It filled and emptied itself twice more as Kuro soaked and scrubbed free the dirt of the alley. It had been years since Phineas had bothered providing soap and hot water for Kuro to bathe in. His showers had been in the cold water from downspouts and rainstorms, and it had never really cleaned him. So by the time he toweled off, the pristine white tub was stained with brown, and a stranger stared back at him in the mirror. Blemishes he thought were his own had been scrubbed free. He could run his fingers easily through his unruly heap of hair, and his dark eyes didn't stick closed when he blinked. If not for his large ears and lack of height, he might have mistaken himself for another child. He struggled with the clothes he'd been left. He'd never had to deal with small buttons much, and the white shirt had an excess of them. It took 3 tries to get them all lined up correctly. The sweater vest was awkward and constricting, though he did manage to struggle into it. He didn't even try to tie the tie, and the polished shoes and pressed pants were so pristine that they looked to belong in a display case rather than on his person. The whole outfit was stiff and heavy, and he feared he would ruin them just by moving around. Once dressed, he tried to put Gray into the cat carrier. She was deeply unimpressed with being caged and complained loudly as Kuro encouraged, then coaxed, and finally shoved her into the plastic container. "Stop whining," Kuro scolded. "They're letting you come with me. You'll probably get fed every day and be allowed to sleep inside." Just as Kuro finished wrestling her into the case, Dubois appeared behind him. "Ready?" he asked with infuriating cheer. Kuro turned to face him, and Dubois' false cheer drained from his face. Kuro's new shirt had spots of blood and holes from his wrestling match with Gray. Despite being clean, his unevenly brown skin made him look like he was still dirty, and his hair was an explosion frozen in time. Dubois buried his face in his hands. "You're hopeless," he said, as he raised a hand to Kuro. He began to chant, and Kuro dove for cover, but the boy was too slow for the experienced hound. There was a brilliant flash of yellow light, and the blast caught Kuro in the chest just before he rolled behind the tub. He curled up, waiting for the pain, but nothing came. He looked down at his chest where the blast had connected and saw a ripple of gold washing through his clothes, stitching the tears back together and leaving clean cloth in its wake. "What are you doing?" Dubois demanded impatiently. "Come on, we're going to be late." He hauled Kuro to his feet, handing him the yowling cat carrier, and grabbed the large trunk. Taking Kuro by the hand, he started walking towards the solid wall of his cell. With a wave, Dubois created a door and pulled Kuro through, out into the bustle of the office. Dubois' wolf, Garmer, joined them in the hall. His presence raised Gray's despondent wails to panicked hisses. Kuro struggled to keep himself between the two so Gray couldn't see the wolf. Dubois dragged Kuro through the halls of the Citadel and out into the bright, clean air of Upper Bytown. Kuro had never been to this part of the city. Detritus Lane passed through the Bytown Market, but the Citadel stood on Embassy Hill, at the center of the wealthiest part of the city. It was far from the market, and none of the filth and rabble of Detritus Lane polluted its boulevards. The street was lined with official buildings and embassies from the 3 kingdoms, all competing for grandeur. Blocky, copper-roofed limestone buildings in the Tirnanog style competed with the sweeping lines of marble and glass of the Acadians. The grand golden halls of the elves, with their steep roofs shingled with shields and central pillars made from living trees, gleamed in the sunlight. Broad sidewalks of artfully interlocking stone stretched along both sides of the boulevard, inviting people to walk, though nobody in the area was poor enough to bother. Instead, they traveled in elegant luxury within enchanted automobiles and carriages. The towering obelisk that was the granite citadel of the Royal Guard seemed out of place in such a bright and verdant boulevard, and all the more imposing because of it. Kuro had little time to take in the view before Dubois pushed him into the back seat of a large black sedan. Dubois shoved Kuro's things into the trunk of the car before climbing in beside him. Garmer took the front passenger seat. "To the Bay Ferry, sir?" asked the driver, working to hide the discomfort at sitting next to the large fanged beast. "Yes, please, fast as you can," Dubois replied as he settled into his soft leather seat. "We don't want to be late." Kuro had never traveled in a car, and it made him uncomfortable. It was too enclosed for the speed at which it moved. He couldn't feel the wind on his face, and the car rocked and swayed in ways that turned his stomach. To make matters worse, this driver seemed to think that having a hound in the car gave him license to drive recklessly. Or perhaps it was the wolf beside him, making him want to shorten the trip as much as possible. Regardless, he weaved through the by-town traffic, cutting off other cars and spooking horses as he whipped around corners with little respect for courtesy or basic physics. Too much of this, and the driver would discover what Kuro had eaten for breakfast. To Kuro's enormous relief, it took only moments to leave Bytown behind and turn onto Zephyr Way, a ferry road that spanned the northern reaches of the continent. Zephyr Way was wide and open, straight and smooth. The roadway was entirely unlike Detritus Lane. The pathway of solid rock was uninterrupted, and few buildings broke the landscape of dark pine forests. They did not travel along Zephyr Way for long, but it was impossible for Kuro to tell how many hundreds of miles they had traveled on that magical highway. Distance was so warped along the ferry roads that they could outpace the sun. The entire landscape passed by at the same speed. The distant hills shot past just as fast as the trees at the side of the road. They turned off at an exit sign that read, Avalon Ferry Port, 6 miles. The road to the ferry followed beside a wide river and was excessively well tended for such a single-purpose laneway. The pavement was fresh and smooth. The tall and lush trees that flanked it were spaced evenly and sculpted to form archways. The forest gave way to a rather less majestic parking lot, already busy with cars, carriages, sleds, magic carpets, and other students. At the mouth of the river stood a large dock at which was parked a multi-level ferry large enough to hold hundreds of Avalon students with room to spare. Despite the bright white paint and the name Princess across the bow of the boat in gleaming gold letters, the boat was neither beautiful nor elegant. It was sturdy and solid, with a sharp prow that looked made for ramming other ships, and a hull so tall that the lowest deck sat nearly a story above the water. It looked almost like a warship, painted to look friendly. Beyond the end of the dock lay the turbulent waters of Hudson Bay. Kuro could see the edge of the Vale dancing back and forth at the waterline, being pushed about by the saltwater waves. Kuro had overheard people talking about the edge of the Vale, but had never seen it. The exits Kuro used from Detritus Lane to the Blandlands were places where the veil between worlds was thin and torn, making it easy to pass through. Here, though, the veil was thick and strong, pressing up against the shore like a billowing and shimmering curtain of silk. Salt and magic do not mix. Even a circle of table salt on the ground can disrupt a spell or stop some creatures from entering or leaving. No magic at all can cross an expanse of salt water like an ocean. Someone could exit the Vale along any saltwater coast just by walking through it into the water. Once outside, however, they could be stuck in the Blandlands until they could find a way back in, usually through the mouth of a river, where the mixing of the waters thinned the Vale. The school was out on an island far out in Hudson Bay, so it wasn't possible to get there without leaving the Fey realm for the journey across open and often violent waters. That kept the school and the students safe from anyone looking to do them harm, and the world safe from the inept fumblings of those learning the magical arts. It also contained the students. The only way off the island were a ferry that ran only a few times a year, or a very long and cold swim without the benefits of magic. Avalon was a prison, though from the excitement of the children swarming on the dock, Kuro thought he might be the only one who knew it. As the car pulled to a stop, Dubois mumbled something that sounded elvish and performed a motion like peeling off a tight dress. A disguise unfurled over him like a silk sheet and settled into place. Dubois was gone, replaced by a man in jeans and a flannel shirt with a big bushy beard and a receding hairline. The disguise was convincing, though it did not hide his golden eyes or the scar in his ear. "I assume you'd rather not be dropped off by the commander of the hounds on your first day. Am I right?" The man that had been Dubois grinned, looking very pleased with himself as he pulled a toque on over his head to cover the telltale ear scar. Dubois wasn't wrong. If Kuro was to be stuck at Avalon, it would be nice if people didn't know he'd been escorted there by police. The closest he could bring himself to thanking Dubois, though, was to grunt in agreement before sliding out of the car. Dubois carried Gray in one hand and had the other on Kuro's shoulder as they made their way through to the ferry, holding him firmly in case he ran. Kuro's already poor mood fouled more deeply as he passed happy families giving tearful goodbyes and excited encouragement to their children. "I love Dock Day," Dubois beamed. "Never changes. The sea breeze, the sounds, the excitement. The crowds, the smell, the noise," Kuro thought. Dubois took Kuro's shoulder and pushed him towards the ferry. The hound stopped a couple of times and almost called out to people he knew, as though he kept forgetting he was in disguise. Kuro also saw someone he knew. He spotted the unmistakable collection of tumbling golden locks and magically enchanted grace of Evelyn, the rich girl from the shoe store. Her uniform was brand new and looked like it had been custom tailored. Her white blouse practically glowed under a crisp gray cardigan, and she could fix her hair in the shine on her magical shoes if ever one of her flawless ringlets fell out of place. Her perfectly pressed plaid skirt bounced and twirled with her as she greeted other students. She behaved as if they were fortunate to have the chance to meet her, waving and smiling like some sort of celebrity. She left the loading of her several suitcases to an exhausted porter. Kuro had just started to feel like Avalon wasn't going to be so bad, but the reminder that he'd be sharing it with her spoiled that hope entirely. Kuro scowled, grabbed his trunk, and trudged towards the ferry. Dubois boarded the ferry with Kuro, acting jovial and excited. He pointed at the scenery and beamed foolishly, all the while keeping a strong hand on Kuro's shoulder. He directed him to the upper deck, which was empty for the moment. Once they were alone, Dubois dropped his jovial uncle act. "Listen, Kuro," he said. "You stay up here, in sight of the ferry captain, for the whole ride. We'll be watching. Step out of line, and you'll have a hound on your heels before you can blink. Got it?" Kuro nodded sullenly. "Good. You're only going to get one chance at Avalon, so don't mess this up on yourself and go running away or stealing things. And try to enjoy it. It's great there, really. Best years of my life." Dubois mussed Kuro's hair in a patronizingly paternal way. Kuro shook off Dubois' empty comforts. He doubted that his time would be much like the hound's had been. It seemed unlikely that Sir Talon Dubois, Knight Commander of the Hounds, had started his career as a prisoner of the state. The only optimism Kuro had in reserve was that nobody would recognize him for what he was, at least for a while. Dubois turned to leave, but Kuro stopped him with a shout. "Well, where are you going with Gray?" The hound still had the cat in her carrier with him. "Don't worry," he said with a wolfish grin. "She's going to a good home." "She's not coming with me?" Kuro didn't know whether to attack the hound or cry. "Of course not." Dubois waved Kuro off dismissively. "There are no pets on Avalon. Besides, with all the other students' familiars around, she'd lose her tiny mind." Dubois gave Kuro no opportunity to argue. He turned sharply and marched below deck, cat carrier in hand. He had tricked Kuro into cooperating by keeping Gray around. Now that Kuro was trapped on a one-way trip to a prison island, Dubois was keeping Gray as a hostage to keep the boy obedient. Kuro fumed. He saw Dubois emerge from the ship and return to the docks, where he stood watching, holding Gray imprisoned in the carrier and grinning victoriously. Kuro looked away from the hound, not wanting to give him the satisfaction of seeing his tears. Kuro turned his gaze to watch the water beyond the veil, hoping the novelty of it would distract him from his misery. He'd pretty much only ever seen cities, and he'd never been out on open water. He decided quickly that he didn't like it. It looked cold, and the waves were big enough to swallow him whole if he fell in, which seemed likely given that he wasn't allowed to leave the open deck. He threw himself onto a bench and dug around in his trunk for something to block the chill of the early autumn breeze of the bay. Kuro started to consider how much Dubois already knew. Probably everything, he imagined. He wouldn't have been allowed to leave the Citadel so easily if Dubois had thought he had any information worth torturing out of him. Perhaps he was being held as a hostage for Phineas in the same way Gray was being held from him. It amused him a little to think of Dubois trying to level threats against his master, using Kuro as leverage. If that was Dubois' plan, he would be sorely disappointed when he found out just how little Phineas cared for Kuro. It did worry Kuro, though, to think what might become of him and Gray if their value to Dubois ran out. Kuro wasn't alone for long. A girl around his age was marched up on deck by an old woman. Kuro couldn't see the girl's expression well. Her dark skin made her little more than a silhouette against the morning sun, but her manner spoke volumes. She crept hesitantly onto deck, clutching a cross-shaped charm on her necklace, and took a great deal of coaxing from her minder to get seated on a bench across the deck from Kuro. She looked around with wide eyes, seeming to bounce between wonder and terror with every second. Kuro observed the pair with some interest, doing his best to remain unnoticed. The old woman spoke in hushed tones and with a familiar authority. Kuro couldn't understand the conversation, partly because it was too quiet and partly because it was in French, but the form was familiar. He'd had the same conversation just minutes ago with Dubois. Perhaps his situation was not entirely unique. The old woman left, moving with far more strength and grace than her elderly form should allow. Definitely a hound, Kuro concluded. He locked eyes with the girl. Her fearful glance changed into an intimidating glare as they stared silently at each other. Her eyes dared him to say something, threatening to knock him senseless if he did. He recognized the stance from the laneway. Not from people, but from animals. She reminded him of a cornered raccoon, full of ferocity born of fear. Kuro tried to express that he was in the same situation, that he was just as stuck here as she was and posed her no threat, but he could muster no words to pass his lips. He shrank under her dangerous gaze. The moment was shattered by somebody's eager cry. "Dad, come and look at this!" Another girl was standing in the doorway at the top of the stairs, grinning so broadly it looked like the top of her head was unzipping. "This is amazing! Oh, you can see the veil whooshing about. The water just goes on forever, doesn't it? And there's a bench right in the front. This is perfect. I'm going to sit here." She was thin and lanky, and at least a head taller than Kuro. Her wiry, dirty blonde hair was rapidly escaping the short braids it had been put into. She wore the school's uniform cardigan and skirt, but the skirt was worn over a pair of jeans and the cardigan had been tied roughly around her waist, likely stretching it irreparably. "Hurry up, Dad!" she shouted excitedly down the stairs behind her. "I found a good seat!" She loped excitedly up to Kuro, moving like she didn't know where her limbs ended, and with an enthusiasm that threatened to send her toppling over the rails. "Hello, can I sit here?" Kuro was about to return her greeting, but the girl didn't give him a chance. "Are you a first year too? This is the very best seat. I've seen them all now. They're mostly the same, but this is way better than inside. It has a better view and isn't full of older students. Why is it so empty up here? This is way better than inside. You can see anything from up here. You picked the best spot. Can I sit here? Do you mind?" Kuro almost had a chance to nod before the girl was talking again, barely taking time to breathe. "Great, I'll get my stuff. I'm Charlotte, by the way, Charlotte Cook, but everyone calls me Charlie. Well, my dad does, but that's pretty much everyone." At that moment, a broad-shouldered man appeared at the top of the stairs, hauling a large hockey bag. "Hey, Dad!" Charlie shouted. "I'm over here. I found a seat." "Are you sure you want to be out here?" the man said. "Won't you get cold?" Charlie rolled her eyes. "I'll be fine. Just grab my jacket." The next few minutes took an eternity to pass. Charlie's father fussed over her, forcing her to wear a coat and wrapping her in a blanket. He hugged her, and they both teared up as they shared painfully sincere farewells. Kuro did his best not to be upset about the affection she was getting, and the other girl on deck was decidedly looking the other direction. Finally, the ferry whistle blew, and the man pulled himself away from his daughter, wiping a dripping nose on his sleeve. "You're sure you'll be okay? Do you have enough blankets? Have you eaten enough? Have you used the washroom?" He sputtered as he took one last look back. "Oh my gosh, yes," said Charlie, urging him away. "I'm fine. Please, you're embarrassing me." A couple minutes later, the whistle blew again, and the ferry began to hum and pull away from the dock. Charlie wrapped herself in a big blanket, propped herself against the rails, and stared steadily forward, scanning the horizon for some sign of the island of Avalon. Kuro looked down at the docks as the ferry sounded its horn to signal departure. There was a forest of waving hands from tearful parents and siblings too young to join the ride. One very serious man with a cat carrier stood unmoving in the crowd, staring at Kuro. Kuro did his best not to look at the hound. His eyes were focused on Gray, his only friend, trapped in a cage, staring back with a look of deep betrayal. Kuro watched her, silently begging her forgiveness for as long as he could. The ferry slid away from the dock towards the mouth of the river, where fresh water mixed with the salt water of the bay. There, the veil was thin enough to pass back and forth between the worlds with relative ease. The ship pressed up against the wavering edge of the veil until a salty wave crashed past, pushing the veil with it. They passed through the shimmering barrier and sloshed out into the mundane world. The hum of the magical motors cut out, and moments later, a rumble of diesel engines started up, and they began to move again. In an instant, the dock was gone, along with the thick forest and the wide river. The only sign of the Fey realm was a faint shimmer of the veil at the mouth where the river had been. Even there, it lacked the clarity of substance that it had on the inside. From without, it looked like the shifting sheen of sunlight reflecting off silk caught in a breeze. The Blandlands were, as the name implied, pale and dull. They looked as though someone had washed half the color out of everything. The world looked, smelled, and sounded muted, like someone had put a bag over Kuro's head. He was used to this effect in the cities, but this place was worse than most. It was rocky and populated only by sparse shrubs and windswept pines. Kuro wondered if he could make it to shore and live in the wilderness of the Blandlands if he dove from the boat now. But the bleak shore didn't encourage much hope. He considered himself pretty accomplished at surviving on the streets, but there weren't any streets here, just endless hills of lichen-covered rocks and short, crooked trees. Kuro returned from his reflections when he realized that Charlie was still talking to him, though she hadn't bothered to face him. Her eyes were still fixed on the horizon. What do you think your familiar's going to be? Someone said that you don't get to learn to summon them till second year, but I'm super curious what mine will be. It's probably going to be something boring and common like a house cat or a dog or a crow, but maybe it'll be something cool like a tiger or an elephant. Wouldn't that be awesome? An elephant would be really useful around the farm for lifting stuff. Charlie continued to talk, barely pausing for breath as the choppy waters slid by beneath the boat. She had grown up on a farm with her dad, far out in the country, where they raised magical creatures. Her dad was a stray, like Emily from the Lost and Found, but her mother had been a witch from Elfheim. Apparently, there had been a hard fight with the Winter Court to let them keep the animals when her mother had died. Strays weren't supposed to own magical creatures. Charlie had been a loophole, though. She was a witch living on the farm, so she was the witch in charge, and her dad was technically just a caretaker. She said the rule was ridiculous because her dad knew more about the animals of the Fey realm than any dumb wizard. She told Kuro of the menagerie of beasts that she'd cared for over the years. From the strange, petrifying chicken lizard creatures she called cockatrices, and the now sway-backed unicorn whose poop smells of cotton candy, to fireproof lizards called salamanders and a family of wood sprites that stole her pencils and used them to hunt beetles. She talked about her favorite books, foods, colors, seasons, and clothes. She talked about her hopes and dreams for school, the classes she was looking forward to, and the fantastic mysteries of the island she planned to uncover. Kuro was annoyed with her at first. He was sad and bitter and had no interest in hearing from someone attending Avalon voluntarily. But she was relentless. She spoke more that morning than Kuro had over his entire life. Her eagerness and bright spirit invaded his misery, and after 2 hours of her ceaseless optimism, he was having trouble holding on to his dread. To make matters worse, she finally decided to include Kuro in the conversation. "What's your name?" Kuro was so surprised by having to say something, he tripped over his tongue trying to remember what it was. I'm called Kuro. Cool, I've never heard that name. Where are you from? Kuro was saved from having to explain his history by a clamor at the staircase to the lower decks, as another group of students climbed to the top level. "Good afternoon. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt," said a girl with a courtly Akkadian accent that would bankrupt most people to achieve. "But we thought it would be ever so nice to become acquainted with our fellow students before we arrived." Kuro recognized the pompous tone from the girl from the shoe store. He looked up to see her effortlessly flowing locks cascading over her perfectly fitted uniform. She was flanked by 2 equally well-groomed young women. "This is Marisa Klepman and Sarah Madevi, charmed daughters of the summer court." She gestured gracefully at her partners before introducing herself. "And I am Evelyn Lemieux Dis, pleased to make your acquaintance." Evelyn's well-rehearsed speech stumbled to a halt as she actually took the time to look at whom she was addressing. Her perfect manner crumpled as none of the 3 passengers on the deck paid her any mind. "Hi," said Kuro, making no effort to hide his dislike. "Hello," said Charlie brightly, though she didn't even turn to face the new arrivals, still too fixated on the horizon to bother with them. The girl alone on the far bench glared at Evelyn with the same feral distrust that she had shown Kuro. "It is common courtesy to stand and introduce oneself when being addressed," asserted Evelyn imperiously. "Oh," responded Kuro. Given that Phineas hadn't wanted Kuro introducing himself at all, he'd never been taught how to do it properly. He thought this might be useful information, but had no intention of using it to please Evelyn. Well, Evelyn's airs of grace had all but dissolved. She forced a smile and turned to the silent girl on the far bench. And what about you? You're not so uncouth as these delinquents, are you? Can I ask your name? A stream of rather coarse-sounding French was all the girl offered the prim and proper trio. Well then, said Evelyn brusquely as she turned and marched to the door. I suppose we will see you at school. Come on, girls, let us find some peers with some sense of propriety. They seem nice, said Charlie without a hint of sarcasm. Who is that talking French? Kuro chuckled. Charlie was so fixated on the misty island, barely visible in the distance, that she hadn't even looked to see what was happening. That was our neighbor. Kuro braved a wave at the angry French girl. I'm not sure she speaks English, but I think I like her. Bonjour, je m'appelle Charlie, Charlie shouted loudly and slowly. This is Kuro. Do you want to be friends? There was a long pause, and Kuro watched the girl tense and relax a couple of times. Marie, she said at last, my name is Marie. She spoke with a distinctive French accent. Nice to meet you, Marie, said Charlie exuberantly. Where are you from? Montreal, she said cautiously. Like the big city outside the Vale? Charlie chattered excitedly. Are you from outside the Vale? Are you a firefly? That would be so cool. I've never met a firefly. What's it like in the Blandlands? Kuro could see Marie starting to tense up again. Charlie, Kuro tried to interrupt. I don't think she knows what any of that means. Oh, I am so sorry. So a firefly, that's a person from the Blandlands who's got magic, but not like a stray though. Those are people with just a bit of magic that can get through the Vale by accident but can't really use any magic. Oh, the Vale is what we call the wall between the Fey Realm and the Blandlands. It was the rainbow wall thing that was on the shore near the docks, Charlie said without pausing for breath. How long since you crossed over? About a week, Marie said defensively. Oh man, this must be crazy for you. Well, if you need to know anything, just ask. I mean, I don't know everything, because if I did, I wouldn't have to go to school, but I want to go to school, so it's okay. Do you guys even know about Avalon outside the Vale? Oh, wait, you might be my roommate since Kuro can't, because I'm pretty sure he's a boy. What residence are you staying in? Autumn Lodge, replied Marie, as though uncertain whether that was good or bad. Charlie did not leave any room for doubt. Though she still refused to take her eyes off the growing misty speck on the horizon, she shouted with delight. That's the same as me! I'm pretty sure it's the best residence. The others sound really stuffy and boring. We get the best weather too. What about you, Kuro? Where are you staying? I don't know, answered Kuro. How can you not know? Charlie exclaimed in disbelief. It was all over the welcome package. I didn't read the welcome package, Kuro grumbled. He'd been so bitter about the whole situation, he hadn't been able to bring himself to read the pamphlets. How could you not read the package? Charlie sounded scandalized. Well, I can sort it out for you. I mean, it's pretty easy. Are you royalty? Definitely not. Are your parents landed or titled or knighted or anything like that? Kuro was less certain about that. Phineas said that he used to be an important person in the summer court, but Kuro was pretty sure that being exiled and arrested for treason and murder meant that it didn't count anymore. Also, Kuro wasn't Phineas's son, just his servant. No, he replied after what was probably too long a pause. Right. Did anyone important sponsor you, like a patron or a scholarship or something? Kuro didn't think what Dubois had done to get him into Avalon counted as patronage. Certainly not a scholarship. I don't think so. Well, then you're with us, she shouted delightedly. Autumn Lodge, where us ordinary folks and fireflies go. None of that mess about court and bloodlines and succession and stuff. You're better off with us even if we're not roomies. Kuro hoped she was right. He much preferred the idea of living with people like Marie and Charlie to mingling with the likes of Evelyn, though he thought it more likely that he'd be held in a dungeon cell than a fancy residence. The sun was high in the sky by the time the island of Avalon came into clear view. From the Blandland side, it was not a beautiful place. A largely barren mass of granite slabs thrust at hard angles from the cold waters of the bay. Sparse shrubs and gnarled trees, bent by the winds, dotted the rocky isle. From a distance, it looked covered in blowing snow, but as they drew closer, the drifts resolved into flocks of white birds. The ferry turned, moving as if to land in an inlet on the shore, where a small stream emptied into the bay. It was barely big enough to land a canoe in, let alone a massive boat. As the ferry drew closer to the inlet, Kuro could see a faint wisp of the veil shifting and shimmering. It was washing in and out with the saltwater waves. Even knowing that they were about to pass through the veil, Kuro found it difficult not to tense up as the ferry continued to drift directly for a rocky shoreline without slowing. Charlie squealed with glee, Mary swallowed and tensed, and Kuro just held on to his seat as the boat sped towards the rocks. Just as the prow was about to collide with the land, the veil swept over them. The bleak and barren rocks were replaced in an instant with a vibrant forested island. The passage back into the Fey realm was an assault on the senses. After hours acclimatizing to the faded colors, muted sounds, and indistinct smells of the bland lands, the brilliance on the other side of the veil was overwhelming. The greens of the grass and the trees, and the petals of the flowers in bloom were so bright that Kuro had to squint to look at them. The scent of each individual blossom announced its presence in Kuro's nose with such intensity that he almost choked, and sounds rang out so crisply that he could pick out which leaves on which trees were contributing to the orchestra of rustling. As his senses adjusted, Kuro tried to absorb some of the geography of Avalon Island. The rough outline of the island echoed the Blandlands counterpart, as was typical, but that was where the similarities stopped. The Blandlands side was all sharp angles and jagged edges. Behind the veil, it was all gently rolling hills. Where the land outside the veil was barren, Avalon was lush and thick with trees. Despite being a dreary, cold autumn day on the Blandlands side, it appeared to be a pleasantly cool spring afternoon on Avalon, at least on this part of Avalon. Directly ahead, where the ship was docking, the fruit trees were in full bloom, and birds sang in every branch. In the distance to the right, tall pines appeared to be covered in snow. To the left, the trees were tall and lush, with a full summer growth of leaves. The actual size of the island was difficult to determine. The space was warped, like that of a ferry road, and the distances were deceiving. The shore seemed to stretch on for miles, but the center of the island looked so close that Kuro felt he could throw a stone at it. He knew that to be an illusion, though, as far too many trees stood between them and the shore for that to be possible. Jutting up from the center of the island was a huge plateau. The sheer stone pillar rose 50 yards or more above the tallest trees, dominating the landscape. On it stood an imposing limestone building that looked more like a fortress than a school. It had steep slate roofs and tall pointed spires, giving it the look of a serrated blade. An anxious knot grew in Kuro's stomach as the school loomed closer. The twisting space of the island made it appear impossibly close, as though standing over him and looking down in judgment. The knot unraveled in surprise as his seat mace burst into exuberant action. Charlie jumped from her seat the moment the ferry dock was in view like a spring that had been wound too tight, breaking her unmoving vigil. She grabbed her overstuffed hockey bag and threw it over her shoulder, knocking Kuro sideways and out of his gloom. She started scrambling for the door while shouting, "Come on, you two! What are you waiting for?" Kuro and Marie looked at each other with shared trepidation and uncertainty. There was little they could do, though, to combat Charlie's insistent enthusiasm. They gathered their things and followed. Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.